Last time we talked about the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education and how Jim Crow has been dealt a constitutional body blow. But that doesn't mean that suddenly a magic switch has been flipped, and now discrimination across the country has ended. And by the way, that's something to kind of remember when we talk about some other advances, some other body blows that Jim Crow receives today. That even though the Brown versus Board of Education is absolutely essential in understanding the advancement of civil rights, even though you got to know the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll talk about those in just a second. The fact is that we can sometimes think that laws change things overnight. But a lot of times laws simply reflect a slow and gradual process that's going on. That it's not as if you're going to see Jim Crow end instantaneously, and you can still see some vestiges of it today. Unfortunately, you have to do probably a little bit more digging than you had to do in the 1960s and 1970s. But the thing is that history doesn't exactly turn on a dime. People are more complicated than that. But the fact is that we saw some major advancements last time. And we also said that to a certain extent, Jim Crow is a Southern problem, and it's going to take a Southerner to fix a Southern problem. And we talked about two Southerners that do that, Martin Luther King and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And you're going to see more of that partnership on display today, because what happens is, we sort of ended with Martin Luther King's March on Washington, in which over 250,000 people march on the Lincoln Memorial after King defiantly stands up against Bull Connor and the city of Birmingham and protests racial discrimination in the city. And that's putting enormous pressure on politicians throughout the country. And Johnson knows that he wants to basically pick up where Lincoln ended, and sort of pick up the unfinished business left behind by the end of Reconstruction. The question is, where is your opening? Because Johnson is too canny of a politician to go in guns blazing unless he knows that he has a chance of getting stuff done. So Johnson, again, is not a charismatic public speaker. He doesn't really have the ability to lead a mass movement, but he is a very canny politician. For King, I think that King is still kind of a canny politician, but really his talents are in leading a public movement and inspiring people. And as it turns out, that provides the 1-2 punch that's necessary here. So after the March on Washington, and also we have to, Johnson was, again, a very canny politician, and President John F. Kennedy was recently assassinated. And remember that Kennedy basically declared civil rights a crusade, but civil rights legislation doesn't really make it out of the House of Representatives. Almost as soon as Kennedy dies, Johnson very pragmatically, some might even say callously, basically uses Kennedy's assassination as a platform to say that the best way to honor the memory of John F. Kennedy is, by the way, to vote for civil rights. And that puts a lot of pressure on politicians throughout the country, not just Democrats, but Republicans as well. And in fact, what happens is that in the aftermath of the March on Washington and Kennedy's assassination, you see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And this is one of those things that you absolutely got to know. It's one of those things, like in Reconstruction, you got to know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But almost as significant, you've got Brown versus Board, you've got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And all of them are absolutely essential that you know. There are 3 asterisks here for a reason. So what this does is that it not only sort of says that the 14th Amendment means exactly what the 14th Amendment says, that there should be no discrimination based upon race, religion, sex, or national origin, but it goes beyond that. The reason it goes beyond that is because remember that the 14th Amendment deals with acts of government, whether that is the federal government or state governments. It doesn't really say anything about private individuals. And one of the arguments during this time period is that the government shouldn't really infringe upon the rights of individuals or business owners to dictate how they run their businesses. Now, the thing is, we have to remember what rights we're talking about. We are talking about the rights of business owners to, for example, force black customers to sit in, the back of a restaurant instead of, in the main area, or the back of the bus. So that sometimes that argument that it's, the government stepping into civil rights infringes upon other people's civil rights, we have to remember what rights we're talking about here. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically makes it illegal, bars segregation of public facilities, not only not only government facilities, but in private businesses. It makes it illegal for employers to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, sex, or nation of origin. Now, obviously, remember that the Democratic Party is this unstable mixture. And it's kind of like ammonia and borax, right, in terms of like the different groups that compose the Democratic Party. And if you put them together, you're going to have this sort of catastrophic effect. And that's kind of what happens after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Gradually, Democrats, especially in the South, begin leaving the party. But in the short term, even though there's a lot of pushback in the Senate over the Civil Rights Act, the fact is that it is it is passed with mostly bipartisan support. The Democratic Party spearheads the Civil Rights Act, and we also have to mention that 80% of Republicans vote in favor of it. Just remember this, because that bipartisanship on civil rights is not going to last. What was particularly brave about the passage of the civil rights in 1964 is that it's an election year, and Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, but he hasn't actually been elected to a term of his own. So what we kind of see is that the election of 1964 is one of those historically important elections. And sometimes elections are historically important based upon who wins and what's decided. The election of 1932 is kind of significant for that reason. It heralds the rise of FDR and the Democratic Party, and it opens up the door for the passage of the New Deal. But sometimes elections are important not based upon who wins or the math or whatever, because, spoiler, Johnson wins, and he wins overwhelmingly. But the election of 64 is historically notable because of who Johnson's running against, Barry Goldwater. If we sort of step back and look in history, we see that typically Republicans, from Theodore Roosevelt to Calvin Coolidge to, people like Wendell Willkie, most of the time, Republicans came from similar backgrounds. They were typically fairly wealthy, highly educated, socially progressive Northerners. But and sometimes you'll get like Midwesterners or Westerners, like Ohio was sort of a breeding ground of Republican presidential candidates and all that. But at the very least, most Republicans tended to sort of reflect well-educated, progressive East Coast backgrounds. And it also means that, again, being progressive, socially progressive, meant that you were in favor of civil rights. I mean, the Republican Party was known as the party of Lincoln for a reason, right? But what's happening is that now it's not just the Republican Party that's picking up Lincoln's torch, but also after the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Democratic Party as well. And remember that political parties mostly reflect the interests and views of the American people. And we know that, tragically enough, one view that was very strong in the United States was the view that people of color were inferior and should be racially segregated. So the question is, what party is going to reflect those views? And that's going to be sort of an open question for a while. But again, it doesn't seem like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party has very much for opponents of integration or people who support the idea of Jim Crow laws. But with Barry Goldwater's nomination, we begin to see the Republican Party shift in a few significant ways. For one thing, remember that the Republican Party, on the whole, tended to reflect the views of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay. The idea being that the government could be used as kind of to basically jumpstart the engine of the economy. And you can do that with tariffs, you can do that with federal supportive infrastructure. And even though you do have like some Republicans who strongly believed in laissez-faire capitalism, Calvin Coolidge was an example of that, by and large, the DNA of the party strongly favored the government intervening in the economy, not to regulate business, but to help and support business. And you can kind of draw a line from Alexander Hamilton of the Federalist Party all the way to the policies of Dwight D. Eisenhower of the Republican Party. Eisenhower was kind of the guy who loved roads and wanted to focus on, continuing the post-war economic boom. So, in other words, it's kind of surprising that there's that much continuity in the party system. But with Goldwater's nomination, things begin to change because one of the things that we see with Johnson's Great Society is, again, remember that the federal government is not just spending a lot of money, it's spending tons of money. And the other thing is that Johnson was great at getting things passed. He was very efficient as a legislator. But the things that were in those pieces of legislation sometimes reflected political realities rather than economic pragmatism or sound business sense. A lot of Johnson's policies were criticized because of just, how much money was being spent inefficiently. Some of you have probably heard the slogan that sometimes, government has the philosophy that you just throw money at the problem. And that's actually kind of a new thing, actually, because historically the federal government has not had that much money. The idea of throwing money at the problem, or that the federal government often throws money at a problem to make it go away, that kind of begins with the New Deal. But, at the same time, the problems that you're talking about are things like, widespread poverty and unemployment. With the Great Society, you're also dealing with poverty, but for many Americans, it's poverty that's localized. It's poverty in places like Appalachia or just rural environments in general. So if you're living in the suburbs, which an increasing number of Americans are doing right now, you might not necessarily be aware of the fact that poverty is still kind of a big deal. And we also just have to mention that, again, sometimes Johnson's approach, and I'm generalizing a little bit here, for almost any problem was to lavish sums of money to kind of spend first and ask questions later. So what happens is that Barry Goldwater positions himself not as somebody who advocates the idea that the government should be able to, spend money, liberally, which Republicans have historically done, and instead, Goldwater positions himself as a Republican that embraces fiscal conservatism, a Republican that believes that the government shouldn't rely on deficit spending. In other words, spending more money than you make and hoping that because of economic growth or increased taxes that you can, pay off that sum later. He kind of goes back to the old Jeffersonian approach of spending as little as possible, which in the 19th century would have been universally, well, not universally, but it would not have been a controversial idea. But remember that when we talk about the government spending money, it's not as if the government is just building a bunch of post offices. It's the government spending money on what we call benefits, on welfare entitlements. people have grown to depend upon that money. And because of the Great Society programs, one of the things that's passed in the Great Society is food stamps. And so now people, literally, people's next meal might depend upon some of these government programs continuing. So Goldwater is kind of pushing for the shrinking of the welfare state, of government spending. But interestingly, at the same time, Goldwater is much more hawkish than most mainstream Republicans or Democrats. I mean, again, remember that there's kind of like this competition to demonstrate that you are more anti-communist than the person you're running against. But there is a ceiling to that, because basically when we're talking about presidents standing up against communism, we're talking about containment. And Goldwater, let's say he wants to go beyond containment. Goldwater actually believes, and at least couches the idea of rolling back communism with nuclear weapons. In other words, you're not just trying to contain communism where it is, you're trying to eliminate it. And, you know, there were some of those voices back in the 1950s when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, which was trying to break away from the Warsaw Pact. But the fact is that while Goldwater is trying to shrink the welfare state, he's also talking about maybe expanding the Cold War. And by the way, because of this, this election is one of those things that it's not so much that Johnson wins as much as Goldwater loses it. And Johnson sees his opening.
'Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I love that. Obviously, Goldwater's campaign struggles. But again, what we do see is that with Goldwater's candidacy, the Republican Party starts the process of reinventing itself. It becomes a party that is more centered in the South and the West. I mean, look at these states, by the way. All these states in the Deep South, the states that are on the front lines of, the civil rights movement, they are voting for Barry Goldwater. And spoiler, most of the people in those states who could vote were overwhelmingly white. And we'll actually touch on that in just a moment. But Goldwater's position on civil rights is complicated. And whether it's complicated because of personal conviction or issues of pragmatism is an open question. I've kind of heard both approaches. Goldwater basically objects to the Civil Rights Act, but not on the basis of racial discrimination. Instead, his objection was because the Civil Rights Act was, too great an infringement on the rights and liberties of businesses. And Goldwater sort of has this libertarian approach. And of course, you might be thinking, well, that's convenient, right? Of course, so you're against the Civil Rights Act, not because you're a racist or something, but because you believe in the rights of businesses, and those rights maybe include the right to discriminate. I've heard kind of arguments both ways. I've heard that this was kind of a cleverly, couched way to appeal to people who were in favor of racial segregation without actually endorsing the principle of racial segregation. In other words, you are still telling people you're against the Civil Rights Act, but you're not coming out in favor of segregation. I've also heard that this kind of just genuinely reflects Goldwater's views. And Goldwater was a candidate who obviously didn't mind speaking his mind, if you look at his comments on nuclear weapons. And so this is just one of those, another example of that. But either way, what starts to happen is that with Goldwater's candidacy, Goldwater sends the message that if you are upset because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that you can find a home in the Republican Party. Goldwater, again, also positions the Republican Party as a party that's more in favor of states' rights, which that in itself seems really darn bizarre, because remember that when the party was first formed in the 1850s, it elects Abraham Lincoln. And remember that Abraham Lincoln has strong feelings about states' rights. And spoiler, they weren't fond feelings about states' rights. But this is what's kind of happening. It's a process that is just unprecedented in American political history. And again, like any political realignment, it takes a while for everything to settle. And in fact, what you're going to see is that when Richard Nixon runs in 1968, successfully runs in 1968, in some respects, he's more of a throwback to traditional Republican Party politicians, including his support of a large welfare state, and his and we'll get to his sort of views on civil rights in just a second. They're also kind of complicated like Goldwater's, but the fact is, though, is that transformation has begun, and you can also see the end result of that transformation. Again, the Republican Party, with Goldwater's nomination, positions itself as being the anti-New Deal party. But the New Deal and the welfare state is still fairly popular. So Goldwater, especially with his other gaffes here, knows that he doesn't have much chance to win. So what he does is kind of a Hail Mary play, is that towards the end of his candidacy, towards the end of that race, he starts buying airtime on TV however and whenever he could. And what he would get is he would get people to sort of stump for him and speak for him as proxies. Let's say that Goldwater wasn't very picky at that point about who spoke for him. And one of the individuals who spoke for the Goldwater campaign was actually somebody without really any political experience whatsoever. He was somebody who was known as a Western actor, or like a comedic actor, and really his only foray in politics was through representing movie studios with their unions. But this is kind of an excerpt from one of Barry Goldwater's proxies.
Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold.
That's right. This is Ronald Reagan's first real foray into politics. And we have to remember that Reagan was kind of typecast into playing goofy roles, comedic sidekicks, that kind of thing. And then when Reagan gets up to speak in favor of Barry Goldwater, he's super serious. And one of the other surprising facts about Reagan that not many people appreciate is, and we'll talk about this a whole lot more in a couple of weeks probably, is that Reagan's political idol was none other than FDR. He really supported the idea of the New Deal when it first came out. But, one of the things that made that all the more compelling is that Reagan was a Democrat and a New Deal supporter. He was a true believer, but he was able to sort of stand up there with, the credibility of having been a supporter of the New Deal. And then, he was able to sort of claim that his trust in the system was broken by just how far the federal government had gone, beyond what was sort of reasonable in terms of how much money that it spent. So Reagan is going to be the end result of this emerging conservative movement. And that's the other thing about the birth of American liberalism, is that, it's kind of like with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So with the rise of American liberalism, we also see the birth of American conservatism. And it's going to take, another 10 to 20 years to really sort of figure out what it's about. But by the end of the 1970s, the coalition that makes up Reagan's voter base becomes clear, and they consist of white Southerners, they consist of business elites, and they also consist of religious conservatives and, in many cases, evangelical Christians who look at the changes going on in the 60s, not necessarily changes because of civil rights. I mean, for some, that is the case, but just changes in general. With the emergence of the counterculture, you're going to see a big pushback against the hippies. And many of those individuals find shelter in Reagan's Republican Party that consistently wins elections from 1980 all the way to 1992. So, mission accomplished, right? The problem of civil rights has been ended forever. Not. Because one of the things that we've emphasized again and again is that sometimes racial discrimination is not explicit. And in many respects, the most important rights in our democratic system were denied to Black Americans without explicitly mentioning race, especially when you're looking at the right to vote.
Hannity Cooper? Get on up now, I ain't got all day. You work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right? Yes, sir. Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss. I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote. It's all right this time. It's right when I say it's right. Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is? We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. How many county judges in Alabama? 67. Name them.
That is a clip from the movie Selma. And note that nowhere in that conversation is race mentioned. It's just not. But everything in that conversation is about race. The restrictions to vote aren't about race in the South. They're officially about things like literacy, about grandfather clauses, about paying poll taxes. It's not about race, but it's all about race. And so also the issue here is that how permanent is the Civil Rights Act going to be? It's not a constitutional amendment. It doesn't have that permanence. And the thing is that still most Black people live in the South, and only a pathetically small number of them actually have the right to vote. So in other words, the ability of Black Americans to protect the advancements that they've achieved so far in the civil rights era depends upon them actually being able to use their political voices. And what's really depressing is when you realize that in states in which close to, if not over 50% of the population is black, states like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, many of those states had some of the strongest restrictions against the right to vote. And we should also mention that in many of those states, not only could black Americans not vote, but in many cases, if you're looking at poll taxes, poor whites in those states also did not have the right to vote in practice. So the question is what to do about it. Again, Johnson understands that pushing for voting rights is going to destroy the New Deal coalition, or at least he sort of comes to terms with that. And so he wants to get as much of his agenda done before that button is pushed, before voting rights, is introduced in Congress. But what happens is that because of drives to register black people to vote in the aftermath of the Birmingham protests, you see events kind of spiral out of control. I mean, just listen to some people who were there with Martin Luther King as well as Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time.
When we left before the Voting Rights Act, right after the Nobel Prize, President Johnson talked for an hour about why he didn't have the power to introduce voting rights legislation in 1965 and gave very good reasons. But he kept saying, I just don't have the power. I wish I did. When we left, I asked Dr. King, well, what did you think? He said, I think we got to figure out a way to get this president some power. And I thought at the time that it was awful arrogant of him to say that, except that we had not been back in Atlanta for 3 days before Amelia Boynton came over from Selma with a report on the voting atrocities in Selma and pleading with Dr. King, you got to come help us in Selma. And this was not anything we were aware of or planned. It was thrust upon us, and we went to Selma on the 2nd of January, and by the end of March, the president had all the power he needed to get that Voting Rights Act introduced.
I think he admired King. I think they were both quite good at politics. I mean, I wanted to mention Selma, and Andrew did. In January of 64 rather, in a phone conversation, one of these wonderful taped phone conversations between King and the President Johnson, Johnson starts talking about 65, about the Voting Rights Act, and King reminds him that the 5 southern states he didn't carry had the lowest voting record. And then Johnson says to King, if you can find the worst condition, this is January 15th, 1965, the worst condition you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, where people are denied the right to vote, to cast a vote, if you just take that one illustration, get it on the radio, get it on television, get it in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, every place you can, then pretty soon the fellow who didn't do anything but drive a tractor would say, well, that's not right. That's not fair. That will help us for what we're going to shove through in the end. And King says, that's right. And if we do that, Johnson said, we'll break through. It will be the greatest breakthrough of anything. This is the Voting Rights Act. Not even accepting the 64 Act. I think the greatest achievement of my administration, the greatest achievement in foreign policy, was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But I think this will be bigger because we'll do things that even the 64 Act couldn't do. Incredible. A partnership between these two guys that, was wonderful and, idealistic and what have you, but very practical. King, I think, as you indicated, knew what he was doing. Johnson wanted him to do it.
So MLK and LBJ basically mastermind a confrontation with officials in Alabama over the question of voting. And the idea is that if basically sheriffs in the area overreact to a voter registration drive, well, then that's going to be a repeat of Birmingham, where you see law enforcement and public officials overreact to defend laws that were explicitly racist. And you get them to overreact and use violence against peaceful protests. That's kind of the logic of civil disobedience. And we have to also be very careful how we talk about this, because obviously what happens in Selma is a great triumph for King, where in front of television cameras, you see yet again another demonstration of white law enforcement officials, attack King and his supporters on the road from Selma to Montgomery. But we also have to remember that it's not like this is a bloodless victory. It's called Bloody Sunday for a reason, and people are wounded, people are killed at the event in the lead up to this confrontation. To a certain extent, the battle for voting rights was not just a metaphorical battle, it was an actual battle, and a battle that involved very real casualties. But what we can say is that despite those casualties, the objective was achieved. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed by Congress explicitly because of what happens in Selma that puts pressure on lawmakers throughout the country, which outlaws restrictions on voting and authorizes the federal government to supervise local elections if there's any question of voter discrimination. So this is the thing, by the way, that outlaws literacy tests, it outlaws grandfather clauses, and it also outlaws poll taxes. And we also have to remember that not only was this, tectonic shift for black people, but also for some poor white people as well, who were eliminated from voting because of poll taxes, which is exactly what it says, or exactly what you think it would be. It is a tax on the right to vote. So it meant that people in many of the states in the Deep South, the people who could vote tended to be wealthier, especially from that all-important planter class. And we're seeing like this, not just democracy or growing democracy for black people and people of color, but also for white people as well. So that ends the story of civil rights. Said nobody who knows anything about American history ever. The fact is that for I think a lot of people, this is kind of where the story ends. That you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and with most of these Jim Crow laws, and it's sort of like the side effects of Jim Crow laws eliminated, we can kind of move on. But that's not what actually happens. In fact, to a certain extent, things get more tense than ever before, because the protests that we see in the South are relatively peaceful, and to the extent that they're not peaceful, that's more because of white police forces than because of black protesters. But the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, it sort of opens up Pandora's box So this is the true epilogue to the American Civil War, and ends a chapter of American history that began in 1619 and lasted until 1965. Said nobody who's actually studied American history ever. The thing is that this is not the end of that story. For a lot of people, it is. For a lot of people, once you see the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board, the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, this is kind of where the story ends. And it actually is about to get even more complicated. Stay tuned just for a second. One of the reasons why Martin Luther King is so popular among white audiences is the fact that he basically promises a revolution without the bloodshed that we normally associate with revolutions. I mean, Jim Crow and the legacy of Jim Crow would require a revolution to really remove. no matter what the Supreme Court says in Brown versus Board. King basically promises that revolution, but it's a revolution that's going to happen nonviolently. Now, King, for his part, is sincere in that promise. He, as a matter of conviction and a matter of pragmatism, he does believe in nonviolence. He doesn't believe in being passive, but he does believe that the crusade against Jim Crow has to be a nonviolent one. But the thing is that ironically enough, if people are hoping for a nonviolent revolution in the 1960s, they're going to be sorely disappointed. So far, the epicenter of the civil rights movement has been located in the South, specifically the Deep South, or what we would call the Southern Sun Belt states, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, etc. And this shouldn't really surprise us because historically we know these are the states where Jim Crow laws and, if we go further back, slavery laws were most deeply ingrained in society. But we also know that Jim Crow, or policies and laws modeled on Jim Crow, they expand beyond the South after Plessy versus Ferguson. In many suburbs, you have homeowners associations that basically prevent Black Americans from living in communities. And the same kind of basic problem exists for, apartment complexes and landlords. There's, a lot of discrimination in housing. And we're not talking about, in southern cities like Birmingham or Atlanta. We're talking about cities like Chicago. So you still see Jim Crow policies, or policies that seem similar to Jim Crow in other parts of the country. So if we shift our attention away from the South and more towards big cities like Los Angeles or Chicago, we see Jim Crow and discrimination in some different ways. We see it especially in the area of housing. Where Black Americans and people of color are either explicitly discriminated against because you might have property deeds or homeowners associations that don't allow for the sale of a home to somebody of a different race. But you also see it in the realm of how people are policed. So let's look at the city of Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles has always been a racial melting pot. Going back to when it was basically taken over by John C. Fremont and it becomes the Bear Flag Republic. But we've also seen how Los Angeles and Southern California, it has been at the forefront of racial riots before. We saw that with the Zoot Suit riot that occurred during the Second World War. And there's been a few other developments. Theoretically, racial discrimination in areas like housing is illegal. Brown versus Board made it illegal, and there was a local law passed in California in 1948 that should have allowed Black Americans to basically, it should have allowed them to buy houses in affluent, mostly white suburbs in and around Los Angeles. And we also have to remember that the Great Migration is still occurring, that African Americans are still moving towards the big urban centers in the United States, and that's really a process that will continue until the 1970s as the United States shifts away from industry a little bit. So the thing is that many of these, millions of African Americans are in some cases forced, not explicitly, but implicitly, to basically get housing in neighborhoods that are really set aside for them. And so, again, this is something that happens because of restrictive covenants that run with property, in which you can only sell property to people of a certain race. And so you have a large community of Black Americans that are living mostly in the Watts sort of area of Los Angeles. They don't have the same economic opportunities as people would in other parts of the city, and they're over-policed. So also remember that what over-policing also means during this time period is what we saw in Selma and what we saw in Birmingham, where basically the police go out and assault nonviolent protesters simply because they're violating an order not to protest on a certain day or at a certain time. And so that's also kind of what we need to remember for more immediate context here. So let's talk about Marquette Frye. Marquette Frye was pulled over by a state highway patrol officer, allegedly for reckless driving. And he's taken out of the vehicle, he's given a field sobriety test, and it's found that he is legally intoxicated, and so Frye is arrested. Now, Frye resists arrest, and officers have to basically subdue Frye in a chokehold that you can see pictured here. And while this is going on, Frye's brother has basically gone to retrieve Frye's mother, Rena Frye, and she arrives on the scene, and she sees a scene like this. And I mean, I don't think that you really have to pretend too hard what it's like to be a mother to know how you might feel about this. And so what happens is that things get physical between Rena and the police. And, basically they're forced to subdue both Marquette and Rena. And this happens in Los Angeles, one of the most crowded urban centers on the face of the planet. And it doesn't take long before people come to sort of watch. And you know how the telephone game works, right? You hear something or see something, and then you spread it to the next person, and then the story kind of changes in the telling. Well, what happens is that the rumor is that the Los Angeles Police Department are kicking a pregnant woman. And that's not actually the case. But, I think what we have to remember here is that when you see those televised images coming out of Birmingham and Selma, and you see that this is what the police are doing, it's not that much of a stretch to think that if they're doing these things in Selma and Birmingham, they might be doing them in Los Angeles. And so what happens is that you have basically a riot that spreads like wildfire, where for 6 days you have civil unrest that occurs. And, partially this is because of what happens here, but it's also sort of been prompted by years and years of, over-policing by the Los Angeles Police Department. And eventually what happens is that you see scenes like this, and no, these National Guardsmen aren't patrolling the streets of cities like, Birmingham or Montgomery or Selma or Atlanta. This is Los Angeles. This is sort of one of America's melting pots. And so, you see these televised images of American cities being gripped by these protests. So this happens in Watts, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles in 1965, and you're going to see other major protests in cities like Chicago in 1968. That's a little bit more complicated. That's more than just a sort of a racially based protest. But still, you see the shift from the South to other areas of the country, at least as far as civil rights go. For many people across the country, scenes like this were confusing. We know that ever since the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's almost been this cottage industry in publishing, where books are published that try to tell you what life is actually like in the South, because you have millions of Americans who go, "Oh, I didn't know the South was like that. I didn't know things were that bad." Where, and partially that's a legacy of segregation and Jim Crow, that you have communities of people who are excluded based upon race. And so there is a lot of ignorance of what life is actually like in the South. But for millions of Americans, they see images like this, and to them, it seems like this is an example of ingratitude. And by the way, this is a facetious statement here, but to those Americans, they're thinking, well, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We were good people. What more could actually be wanted here? And Obviously, in the case of California, there's a lot more that can be wanted, but not all Americans are necessarily aware of, some of the complexities in housing policy. But I think what is interesting is that Johnson has a very philosophically astute observation in response to riots like the Watts riot. He says, "I don't know why we're surprised. When you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years and then you let him up, what's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off." It's one of those rare, non-profane Johnson aphorisms. And so Johnson kind of understands that, it's not as if Martin Luther King controls every single black person in the United States. Not even close. Martin Luther King is one voice, one leader of one movement, and a very successful one. But he is just one voice of many. And let's listen to some of those other voices.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing.
That was the voice of Malcolm X, probably, at least at the time, the most famous, but certainly not the only black voice that rejected both nonviolence and integration. And this voice is actually nothing new. We talked about the fact that Marcus Garvey believed ultimately that the only way for black people to be safe in the United States is for black people to be separate and given their own political power, their own sort of nation state. And he sort of champions the Back to Africa movement. But again, the Back to Africa movement was based on the idea that black people would be unsafe unless they have their own nation state. And you see that idea come back in the 1960s. And so with leaders like Malcolm X of the Nation of Islam, with Stokely Carmichael, who leads the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what you see is a rejection of nonviolence and to a certain extent a rejection of integration, because the idea is that both of those things play into the hands of segregationists. So, by the way, Malcolm X does have kind of a religious conversion later on in his life. I mean, he is a Muslim before this point, but he basically goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca and apparently has like this religious experience there that later on causes him to renounce violence. But that's not really the Malcolm X that people remember. They remember the Malcolm X before that experience where he's almost kind of seen as an enemy to King. And you also see the formation of the Black Panther Party. And this is a party, and remember, the Cold War is sort of in the background of everything, that also kind of embraces communism. And it also embraces the use of force and vigilantism to protect people within the black community. What we also should kind of mention is that many of these leaders and groups also kind of gives King and his SCLC additional power and influence. This is based upon the idea of good cop, bad cop. So if you're looking at the mindset of segregationists, what you see is a variety of voices and individuals beating the drum for civil rights. So you can either have Martin Luther King, who basically makes the argument that, racial segregation is going to have to end, but it can end nonviolently. So you can either take that perspective, or you can take what Malcolm X is offering, or Stokely Carmichael, or the Black Panthers. In other words, you can sort of anticipate, the end of segregation using violence. So the idea is that between, if you're looking at it again from the perspective of segregationists, between those two options, suddenly King is looking pretty good. And we should also kind of mention, though, that King's success, especially in his use of civil disobedience tactics, it not only is important to understand the growth of civil rights for Black Americans, but other people of color, because the 1960s is this decade. This generation, practically, in which you just see so much change that's sort of confined to just one decade. Native Americans aim high with the American Indian movement. Yes, it's called AIM. That's the best humor I can summon at 8:05 in the morning. But anyway, you see the civil disobedience campaign break out, in which Native Americans begin basically hunting and fishing on government land as a way to sort of almost mimic the approach that you see Martin Luther King use in the South. You also see Cesar Chavez unionize sharecroppers who are mostly Latino American in the American West. And we know that anytime we use the word sharecropper or indentured servant, well, let's just say that that's not one of the more enviable jobs, in that obviously when you're dealing with sharecroppers and planters usually have by far the most bargaining power. So Cesar Chavez actually gets or helps create what is called the United Farm Workers Union in 1962. It's kind of a sign that increasingly Latino Americans are going to be a powerful political voice in the United States going forward. You also see the Bracero program suspended and terminated because of the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Remember, this is that program that Johnson signs into law as part of his Great Society, in which the quota system is suspended, and instead you basically have this lottery-based system. So Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement isn't just important in order to understand how Black Americans are able to strike down Jim Crow in the 1960s. It also leads to a whole host of reform movements for people of other races as well. So you're going to see more conversations on the protest movements of the 1960s. They were fanned by Martin Luther King, but the other thing that fans the flames is this little war in Southeast Asia known as the Vietnam War. And that will be for next time.